Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. Lately, I've been coming across a lot of arguments for Hans Hermann Hoppe's argumentation ethics. So I wanted to get somebody to come on the show and debate me on the subject. I Googled experts on argumentation ethics, and today's guest came up. He's a libertarian writer and patent attorney. He's spoken, lectured, and published widely on various areas of libertarian legal theory. And his publications include Legal Foundations of a Free Society. Stephan Kinsella, welcome to the program.
Hey, thank you. And it's Stephan.
Stephan, okay, sorry. So should
Sure.
have asked ahead of time.
That's all right.
Okay, so we don't end up just disagreeing over terminology when in actuality we agree. I want to just get your definition of some terms. So the three terms I think that are relevant for this are ethics, self-ownership, and rights. So how, when you use those three, are you using them?
I think that's actually really good. I was going to make sure we start with rights. I mean, ethics, of course, as I was telling you previously, I am an anarchist, Rothbardian type libertarian, but my roots were in objectivism, and I still believe in Rand's four, core principles of reality, um, reason, self-interest, and capitalism in general terms. And so to me, ethics is just a branch of philosophy that deals with how man ought to live, what we should do. It's about the morality of things. So to me, that's what ethics is. And it has applications in your life. How should you live? How should you live your life? And this would apply even to Robinson Crusoe alone on his island, although most people seem to think that ethics only has to deal with interpersonal relationships. But being sort of a Randian, I don't believe so. I think that even Crusoe, alone on his island, could perform immoral actions.
I
They wouldn't
agree.
be violating anyone else's rights, and they wouldn't be doing something wrong to another person, but they would still be immoral. So ethics is a broad category that describes how you should live your life. And then in society, it would apply to both interpersonal relationships, like how you should treat other people. I mean, you could think of it as major and minor things. I mean, I think
Sure.
Henry Hazlitt said something like manners or minor morals. So manners is how you should treat people. If you're cruel to your grandma for no reason, you're being an immoral person. If you're a dishonest, lying person, you're being an immoral person. But you're not violating rights. There's a second or a third tier of violation of immorality or ethics violations, which is when you get into the area where you're violating people's rights, and then we can talk about what the rights are.
Okay.
Um, Go
Would
ahead.
you accept as a definition? Because I like what you said, not that I disagree with it, but just to sort of get it into a more compact definition. Ayn Rand's definition of a code of ethics is a code of values to guide a person's conduct. And that applies whether you're on a desert island, you're Robinson
I
Crusoe.
don't I mean I'm not too I don't have too many problems with that, but I'm a little bit leery of the word value. But the way
Okay.
the Randians use it, I think has been misused, and it leads them into error with the intellectual property issue. For
Okay.
example, Rand's theory of rights, she says that rights come from man's needs to create values in the world, and I think there she goes astray from common sense and Austrian economics, which understands that a value, um, I think value should be more thought of as a verb than a noun. Like
Okay.
when you and when you seek to achieve something, you demonstrate that you value it. Now, the Austrians would call that demonstrated preference. Now, that's very similar to Randian, Ayn Rand's idea that a value is something that you act to gain and or to keep.
Yeah.
But to call something an entity, like it's an existing thing of value, and then you say, when we create values, we own them, and therefore intellectual property is justified, which is one of my main disagreements with Rand. I think that's the problem. So you can say that ethics or morality is a code of values. If by that, but I really, the way I would think of it is that every human has values, and either they're consistent with our nature as humans or not. Like either you're a sociopath or you're kind of a normal, well-adjusted person with the same values that most other well-adjusted people have. And then ethics is the code of rules that helps guide you to, to flourish in light of those values. But
Right.
I don't know what it means to say something is a code of values.
Well, I would just say in Rand's definition of value is that which you seek to gain or keep. So I would say a
Yes.
code of values is a code to guide your behavior, a code that tells you how to act, what things you should pursue, what things you shouldn't pursue, and how you should pursue them.
Yeah, but Ayn Rand herself more or less admitted in so many words that her whole ethics is hypothetical. It's not categorical. Because she said if
Well,
I
she didn't
believe
say
she,
hypothetical. She said conditional. But I don't.
well,
Yeah,
yeah,
I don't want to get too much into
okay, that's fine. So
her
let's
thing.
go to the other one, self-ownership
No, but I
rights.
just want to make
Oh,
sure
so go ahead.
what we're basically talking about is that a code of ethics is a code, or ethics is a code that tells you how to behave. In essence, it's what you should do, whether you're alone
Yes.
on a desert island or if you're amongst people, whatever. It provides you with a framework for how to conduct yourself.
Yes. And I don't want to be nitpicky, but I've seen that imprecision and equivocation and different nuances and terms can lead to confusion.
I agree
And
with you.
so, like, as a lawyer, I'm reluctant when people say the libertarian law code of a free society. I mean, a code to me is something that a legislature writes down. I would tend to
Okay.
think of it as a set of principles, but I think it's the same
I-
idea.
I'll 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 go with it. But a
Something
set
that
of
guides your
principles for
something
how
that
you
you
should
can
behave.
consult to guide your actions to fulfill your purpose as a human and to fulfill your proper values in accordance with your nature. I mean, so I think that's roughly consistent with
Okay.
the way Randians look at it.
I can accept that. Okay, so self-ownership. What is meant by self-ownership?
As a lawyer and as someone who thought about this for a long time, as someone steeped in Austrian theory, which emphasizes the importance of the concept of scarce resources, which is the reason for the emergence of property rights. If we lived in a world where there were no scarce resources, which is unimaginable, to be honest, if we were ghosts or something, or if we're little omnipotent gods or something, um, property rights would never emerge because there could be no conflict. But because that's not our world, then the concept of property rights emerges. And we can get to that on the third prong of your question. But self-ownership to me is another potentially confusing term because I think what it means is uh, every person is the rightful owner of their body. That's what I think it means. Their body considered as a scarce resource, a unique scarce resource. The problem is when you say self-ownership, it's you get into all these kind of metaphysical or mystical connotations. Like, for example, if I say I believe in self-ownership, then some atheist will, which I'm an atheist too, they'll tell me, oh, you must believe in the soul because who's the thing that's owning your body? And it's like, listen, I think you're making it too complicated. It's a really simple thing. There are people walking around the earth with bodies. Who has the right to control that body? And the libertarian answer, and I think the objectivist answer, is that each person that is identified with their personality with that body is the owner. It doesn't mean you believe in a soul in the sense of a mystical separate being, but conceptually there are different things. The person and the personality of a person is distinct from their corporal body. But every person's identity as a person, regarded by others in society, is associated with, and you could say housed by a body. I want some kind of weird dichotomy where there's a difference. So there's a soul that's up there pulling the strings and controlling it. But if you find a dead body in a closet, there's a body, but there's
There's no
no
self.
mind.
Right.
And just like the concept of brain and mind are different. Mind refers to a different thing in the world than the word brain does, although they're related. You can't have a mind without a brain, but you can have a brain without a mind, right? A dead body has a brain, but it has no
Right.
mind. So I think that self-ownership simply refers to the presumption against slavery, the presumption that every person is the rightful owner of their body. Now, not always. This can be defeated if you perform an act of aggression and you forfeited some of your rights. So, for example, a criminal committing an act of aggression, for the duration of that act at least, has forfeited his right to complain about force being used against him in self-defense. And I also think even after the fact that the victim has the right to use force for retribution or for restitution. So, but the presumption is that every person is initially the owner of their body. That's what self-ownership means to me.
Okay, so in short, self-ownership is just means you're the rightful owner of your body. You have the right to use and disposal of your own person.
I mean, to be technical, I would say it means you have the right to stop other people from using your
Okay.
body. It's the right to exclude others. It doesn't mean I have the right to use it,
Okay.
because there are many uses to which I could put my body, which would invade others' rights. So no one has the problem with saying that the right to own a resource, including your body, means that you have the right to use it, is that everyone will immediately come back and they'll say, but you just admitted that I can't swing my fist when it hits your nose, or I can't shoot my gun into the air if the bullet will land on your property. So, that means your property rights are not absolute, like you said, because you just said they're a right to use, but now you've conceded there's a way I can't use it. And therefore, you can't complain when the government comes in and limits the use of your property rights a little bit more, because after all, they're not absolute. So if you don't characterize property rights as a right to use, you never have that problem. Instead, we should characterize them as a right to exclude others. So my right to my body means I can prevent anyone else from touching my body or using it without my permission. It doesn't give me an absolute right to do whatever I want. I mean, likewise, if I own a home, I can't, it doesn't mean I have a right to use it however I wish. What it means is I can stop other people from using it. And that practically means that I can put a barrier up around it, no one can come in, and I can pretty much do whatever I want within the walls of my house. But if I shoot a cannon up in the air and it goes into your house, now I violated your property rights.
Yeah.
So but the reason that I don't have the right to shoot a cannon into your house is not because there's a limitation on my property rights. It means it's because you have property rights, and property rights, his property rights are a limit on my action. So I think we should think of property rights as a limit on other people's action, which is why we characterize it as a right to exclude. Now, again, that's being technical, but I do think that that's an important distinction.
So self-ownership, you would say, would be the person is the rightful owner of his own person, and he has the right to exclude others from.
That's what it means. So property ownership means property rights, and property rights, all rights are property rights, and property rights just are the right to exclude others from using your certain resource.
Okay, and finally, before we can get to the meat of the thing, rights. How do you define rights?
And that's an interesting question, because we have legal rights and we have something else that we libertarians and objectivists use as an external standard to criticize existing legal rights.
And I'm talking about the latter, basically what historically would be called natural rights, what objectivists call individual rights.
And so, and the analog in law would be positive law versus natural law.
Yeah.
So positive law are the laws that exist that are enforced, and they can be good or bad, right? But when you say it's bad or good, you're criticizing it based upon some external standard like natural law or natural right. So let's make an analogy. So between possession and ownership. So possession is what Crusoe could do on an island. He can possess and use scarce resources. But in society, there's a possibility of conflict. So we want to allow people to trade with each other and live among each other, but we want to prevent fellow people from having a conflict with us and using the resources that we have that we want possession of. So we have property rights that emerge, or that are norms that try to enforce possession. So you can think of like possession as a physical, factual thing, and then norms and property rights, or the normative or the legal apparatus that come around that, right? And so likewise, you can think of legal rights or positive law in a legal system is basically a claim or an obligation backed by a sanction, right? And in the legal system of the statist world, that's usually physical force by the government's police or courts or something like that. But when we criticize one of those laws, we're saying that this law violates someone's rights, or this law gives someone a right that's not really a real right. What do we mean by that? So what we mean there is a right, I would say it's some kind of This is actually difficult. I've worked on this myself, and it's difficult to do because people don't pay attention. And it's all of the map. I think a right is a claim to a resource that can be justified with reasons that are not self-contradictory.
Okay,
Like
so
it's an awkward way of putting it, but I basically think it's a claim that can be justified
right.
to have exclusive use of a resource.
Okay, so the definition that I go by is basically exactly what you said. It's straight from a dictionary after dictionary. It's either a moral claim to something or a just claim to something.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm okay with the use of the
And by the
term
way, the word
resource.
justice was crucial here. Was probably going to, I mean, just means justified, which means someone has to come up with a reason to defend this claim they're making. And this is where
Right.
argumentation ethics comes in. But go ahead.
Okay. Well, that is perfect because I now want to know what is argumentation ethics. Now that we have our terms defined, what is the theory of argumentation ethics?
Okay, so here's the way I look at it. I would say until the 1980s, you could say there were two main ways that, say, well, maybe not objectivists, but libertarians and objectivists think of things like rights and policy and what laws we should have. Basically, it's the deontological or natural rights type of approach, which I would put Ayn Rand in that category. And also the consequentialist or pragmatic or utilitarian side, which, by the way, I think
Mises and Hazlitt, right?
Yeah, Mises was consequentialist. I haven't read Hazlitt's moral stuff much, but I'm not sure. But definitely the law and economics types and the utilitarians, Richard Epstein. However, I think Ayn Rand would not. I mean, she hated dichotomies. There were artificial dichotomies, and I think she always said that the moral is the practical. So I don't think she would have denied that her rights theory was also consequentialist in a sense, like it's going to lead to good consequences for man in its proper state. So I do think
consequential on the individual level, basically. Is
correct.
Right, is the standard of value. So the individual, what the beneficial consequences to himself, that would be the ethical. Whereas the utilitarian is more broad. It's what's best interest.
Correct. And that's why I'm using two different.
Right.
So Randy Barnett, in the introduction to his really provocative book, The Structure of Liberty, he distinguishes consequentialism from utilitarianism. Like, I think he views utilitarianism as a subset of consequentialism. So, and I tend to agree with that. Like, I think people call Mises a utilitarian, but of course he attacked utilitarianism in the economic sense because values are subjective and they're not cardinal. They can't be added up.
Right. His utilitarianism was basically, this is what most people would want, and this is what is going to give the results that most people want. But it doesn't mean.
Well, I think his utilitarianism was consequentialist. In other words, what he said was, if you want
right
certain basic values that most non-sociopathic humans share, like peace and prosperity and cooperation, then economic logic shows you that the way to achieve that is to have private property rights and a free market and things like that. So, and of course, he shared those values too. So he wasn't a sociopath either. So what he was saying is, if you want peace and prosperity, we need free markets. Now, that's not utilitarian. That's consequentialist. But it's not consequentialism that is really incompatible with the natural rights argument, which I think these things all complement each other. But my point is, I say until the 80s, the two main thoughts would be consequentialist / utilitarian and deontological, people arguing from natural law. Now, one problem that some people in the meantime have noted, like Hoppe, who we're going to talk about, and Kant, who I think is unfairly maligned by the objectivists, because there are different interpretations of Kant, whose writing was admittedly murky. But if you do take the American idealist skeptical interpretation of Kant, then the Randians have some good criticisms of that, like David Kelly. But there is apparently a realist interpretation of Kant on the European continent, and a lot of his stuff is very similar to Rand. I mean, Rand talks about axioms and things we know for sure, because to deny them would be self-contradictory, like the law of identity and the law of the idea that there's a universe that exists and that the fact that there is consciousness. This is exactly the same way that these realist Kantians argue for their a priori axioms. And so I think it's a little bit of a verbal or a thing, right? But in any case, some of these realist Kantians point out, following Hume, I believe, that one problem with natural rights reasoning is that you switch domains and you go from an is to an ought. You're saying man's nature is this, and therefore he ought to do this. And that doesn't quite follow, because you're going from a domain of description to a domain of prescription, which I think Rand, as I said earlier, implicitly recognized by admitting that you really can't have an argument that people shouldn't commit suicide, because all rights and all morals follow from the choice to want to live, right? So that's the but that's the leap she makes. Like the leap is taking for granted that people have values. If you have values, like I want to live, well, then you should live how? As a man, because you are a man. And therefore, man's nature, combined with your desire to live, has certain implications. So her argument is hypothetical in that sense. And that's fine, because when it's hypothetical, that's how you get over the is-ought gap. You introduce a value that people happen to have. I think it's natural that they have it. And not everyone has it, because there are sociopaths. But that's how her argument works, right? But when you just say man's nature is this, therefore he should do this, you have the is-ought gap. So there were some concerns about the natural law approach. And of course, there are the usual concerns about the utilitarian approach, which is that it violates subjective value and values are not ordinal, all those kinds of things. Also, in some cases, if you're a strict utilitarian, and even if you're a strict consequentialist, you can come up with scenarios that lead to horrible results that we all intuitively rebel against, like the trolley problem and, would you kill this one guy to save the earth? I mean, things like that, So in the meantime, there have been a couple of other approaches to rights. One is the intuitionism approach of like Michael Humer, who's fairly recent in this field. I don't really know what intuitionism quite means, other than it seems right to me, so let's go with it. The other one is the approach of Jan Lester in his book Against Leviathan, who rejects natural law, and he rejects these systems that try to prove rights, and instead he has it's kind of like a Popperian conjecturalism, and it's sort of like this idea that you conjecture things and then you subject them to tests. I think that is confused because it's subjecting, it's making the same confusion that Milton Friedman and the modern economists do when they try to make economics be more like the causal sciences like physics and subject to verifiability. Rand, to her credit, never made that kind of mistake. So those are those two. Like there's intuitionism and there's conjecturalism, which are actually I think very similar. But let's forget about those. So you have basically consequentialism and you have a natural law. So in 1985 or 6, Hans Hermann Hoppe wrote. Do you want to talk about argumentation ethics now?
Yes.
So Hoppe started publishing these articles expounding his own theory of rights, which he calls argumentation ethics or discourse ethics. Now, and he tried to avoid the is-ought gap that he saw following Hume in the natural law arguments. Although there's a lot of wisdom in the natural law arguments, but you have to find a way to get the values in there so that you don't have this logical gap. So he pointed out like two problems with the natural law arguments. One was the is-ought gap, which I mentioned. And another is that human nature really is pretty diverse and diffuse. So it's only going to get you so many concrete prescriptions that people can follow. We've seen this in the world. People live in all kinds of different ways over time and in different countries. You really can't say that everyone should be a spaghetti eater, or, you know what I mean? Like, the prescriptions are going to be pretty limited. I mean, you could say, be honest. Okay, you can have general things, but that's not really a code of ethics, is it? This is just like general, general rules of thumb. So those are the two problems with that. So what he said was that if you think about what we mean by rights, they're justified claims to control over a resource. Well, to be justified, it has to be actually justified by reason, which means someone has to give an argument that explains why they think they have the right to do this and you don't have the right to do that. So they have to give a reason, but they're giving it to another person. So it's always in a physical context where you have human beings engaged in discussion about how we should treat each other. But his point was this. He borrowed from the philosophy of his PhD advisor, Jürgen Habermas, who's a Democrat socialist, famous European philosopher, who pioneered this theory of discourse ethics, and his colleague in Germany, Karl Otto Appel. And the discourse ethics, now the way that these two guys, they're both, German Democrat socialists, the way they took it was in a discourse community of people. I mean, they took it to mean democracy and social welfare rights because, so they took it in that direction. What Hoppe did was he said, no, I'm just going to throw all that stuff away, but I'm going to take the core that makes sense, which is that the only way you could ever justify a normative claim, like a rights claim, is in a discussion with other people. But that discussion happens in the real world. And I think Ayn Rand would appreciate this. She always says, we're not ghosts. We're men made of matter living on the physical world. We're real beings. So Hans is saying these justifications happen in a real context. They're not imaginary. They're not fictitious. That means two people sitting next to each other, and guess what they're doing? They're not killing each other, because if they're killing each other, they can't have a reasonable debate. To have a reasonable discussion, you must acknowledge the other person's humanity, and you must acknowledge some degree of the desirability of peace and everyone's control over the resources. Because when I'm trying to persuade you about socialism or capitalism or whatever I'm trying to persuade you of, I'm trying to appeal to your reason, and I'm trying to give you reasons that make sense to you. And I'm implicitly willing to let you go about your business if you don't agree. In other words, I'm not coercing you to accept my arguments. I'm trying to persuade you by the force of reason alone. That's what Hoppe emphasizes. I mean, if I'm holding a rock up saying, if you don't admit that I'm right, I'm going to kill you, this is not a real dialogue or discourse or argument. So a genuine argument always necessarily presupposes by both parties basically a core level of rights among each other. And because that's inherent to the nature of what human reason and discourse is, then Hans's argument is that because of this, whatever you want to argue for, you can't argue for some proposition that would fundamentally contradict what we're both presupposing is true to help prove what we're trying to argue for. So the core of argumentation ethics is identifying that normative argumentation has normative presuppositions, and that therefore you could never ever conceivably justify a norm that contradicts whatever those are. And then he points out what those are, which is peace and recognizing your body rights and my body rights, at least for the duration of the argument. And then he builds on it from there. And then ultimately what he ends up saying is that if someone argues for socialism, they're essentially coming up with a rule that they're proposing that everyone accept, that it contradicts what the rules are of the argument itself. So socialism is effectively, I can hit you, but you can't hit me. I can take your stuff because I'm me and I'm not you. But as I think Kant would agree, and Hoppe would agree. That is not an argument. It's not a reason. It's just an assertion that we're now back down to the might makes right level, and we don't care about reasons. If I'm stronger than you, I will take your stuff. So why are we even bothering wasting our time engaged in a fake argument, right? If I really want to give a reason, I can't just say, well, the reason I get to take your stuff or to enslave you is because I'm me and you're you. That's not a reason, because, you know, as far as we stand in the argument, we're both similarly situated. There's no, if I say that I have a right to enslave people, it's got to be for some reason. And that's because I guess, a human actor walking around the world. But the other guy is a human actor walking around the world, so he has a right to enslave me. So it makes no sense.
Mm-hmm.
The point is, in Kant and Hoppe would call these particularizable arguments. So they're not really reasons. So this thing we call the universalizability requirement means if you want to have a reasonable, sincere, genuine dialogue with people, trying to reach a reasonable agreement by appealing to the nature of reality and the facts that we can really prove, you have to appeal to things that are universalizable and that are not just a stand-in for just brute force. Does that make sense?
That's, you explained it exactly how I understand it. So my first question is this: rights, the concept of right in the sense that we talked of earlier as a just or a moral claim to a resource, is an ethical concept. It's dependent on an antecedent moral theory. That's what it's referencing. When you say it's a moral concept, you have to have a concept of morality. Hoppe starts with his argumentation at self-ownership, at rights. How isn't that a problem for the theory? It's not reliant on any antecedent theory. It just states you have a right to your body. But what's it referencing?
Let me think about that. I'm not sure that's correct that he just starts there. It is certainly true that, say, Murray Rothbard did not have a complete theory of ethics. But then whether Hoppe goes further, but let's just imagine that we live in a world 500 years from now when we're very cosmopolitan, everyone's very rational, everyone's very rich, people respect each other's rights because we've gotten used to it, sort of like we do now to a certain degree. Your main concern would be that you live among people that happen to share your values. Now, why do they share your values? And they're rational enough to know the consequences of policies that would undermine those values. You know, if your neighbor respects your property and doesn't steal your lawnmower, you know, you're not going to be too upset that he doesn't have a theory that goes down to epistemology until the bottom of everything and he can explain it. Your main concern is that he shares your values. And I do think that the human race, the way we've evolved as a social species, most people that are normal have a certain degree of, well, everyone's got self-interest, but people also have a degree of empathy for others. In other words, they value themselves and they value their family, but they also value other people to a degree, maybe not as much, but that's healthy and normal. And that's not altruistic. That's just, I think even Rand would agree with that. So we naturally value other people, and to make someone prove, I mean, this reminds me of something I've always complained about as a kind of ex-objectivist or whatever you want to call it. You know, David Kelly, who's an old friend of mine, I love him. He's brilliant. I don't agree with him on downward causation and certain things, but he's brilliant. But he wrote an entire monograph on benevolence, if you know what I'm talking about. And it was trying to justify benevolence. And he does a good job. But what's interesting is that the objectivists felt it necessary to justify being nice to other people. It's like, why do you need to justify being nice? I mean, to my mind, we need to justify being bad to other people, or you need to justify using force against people when they oppose it. So if a robber breaks into my house, he doesn't want me to use force against him, but I'm thinking like, I think I'm justified in doing it because I can come up with reasons. But to justify something that we want people to do that we all agree with, like why would you even need to write an extended argument? Only objectivists would feel guilty about being good people, and they feel like they need a rational justification
Well,
for it. It's kind of crazy.
hold on. That
Go
very
ahead.
term, a justification for being good, but good is exactly what needs to be proved. And Hoppe himself said this: his ethical theory has to be proved by reason. That's what he said, which means that your behaviors, how you conduct yourself, needs to be proved by reason. That's what you said. Hoppe said. You also told me earlier that morality applies even if you're alone on a desert island. Argumentation ethics
Hold on,
could
hold on,
never
hold on, hold
apply
on,
if you're
hold on,
alone on
hold
a
on.
desert island.
Hold on. I'm not sure if Hans would agree with that. I mean, he probably would,
No,
but
no,
he's
no.
not he's
But
not a Randian. That
he
that was my
wouldn't.
view. That
No,
was
no,
my
but
view.
he wouldn't. But what I'm saying is that's one of my critiques of Hoppe is that he begins with argumentation and begins with rights, but those rights have no antecedent morality to justify it. You yourself said that morality would exist on a desert island. That what means that you have
Yes.
a separate moral theory aside from argumentation ethics, but he doesn't, that I've seen, provide that.
Yeah. So, and I don't want to misspeak here. Here's what I'm going by my memory. Um, I mean, Hans's main concern is as a political economist. He's
Mhm.
talking about legal policy, which laws and rights are justified. So he's focusing upon interpersonal relationships. He does talk about the Crusoe thing in economic analysis, but not in moral theory. I really doubt he would disagree with anything I've said here so far, but I don't think he's focused on that, like on personal morality. I think he just has conventional views on that. Like he takes the normal Western liberal cosmopolitan view about morality. I'm sure he thinks lying is wrong and being faithful and faithful, all that kind of stuff. But he doesn't, that's not part of his theory.
Mhm.
I guess in a way, part of your question is, do you need to have that um, to have a coherent view on law and on political ethics? I don't think you do. I don't think you have to. So this is the Randian thing. You have to have an all-encompassing philosophy that explains not everything, but like at least has the four major branches, maybe the
Mhm.
aesthetics too. Um, and that was one of their complaints about libertarians, is they cast away, epistemology and metaphysics and aesthetics and even morality, and they just went for the politics part, and they basically hijacked her stuff, and they took one part without the rest, which is necessary. I understand that view if you're building a whole philosophy and a life view.
Mhm.
But I really don't think politics is that hard, and I do think that we had lots of politics. Like I think some things can be, I won't say ad hoc, but they could be somewhat separate, specialized disciplines. I'm kind of shooting from the hip here because uh, I don't know anyone who's done the whole thing to my satisfaction. But I will say I don't think so. I think Hans on self-ownership, he's taking for granted that people have a question. Like let's say people have the question, okay, what should the law be? Should there be
Mhm.
slavery or not?
Okay.
Who should own your body?
Mhm.
And he comes up with a kind of Rothbardian, Hoppian,
Right.
Lockean argument why if you try to justify enslaving another person, your claim is going to be necessarily uh, uh, an incoherent claim because it contradicts
Okay.
other presuppositions that you must make when you engage in a real dialogue about this. That's why he calls his first article on this, that was well known in Liberty Magazine, I think in 1988. I think the title is The Ultimate Justification of the Private Property Ethic.
Right.
But by
See,
ultimate, what he means is that he's showing that there's a contradiction involved in denying it. Just like Ayn Rand used the same technique for her axioms of existence and things like consciousness, and like Mises uses for his human action axiom.
well, okay, but my problem is it seems incoherent to me to define rights by reference to morality, not have a theory of morality, and then say we don't need a theory of morality because we're only talking politics. But that's in essence what you have to do. If a right is a moral claim or a just claim to a resource, then you have to have some morality there. But he doesn't. And that just seems to me a gaping hole in the theory. You simply cannot start unless you're not going to bring ethics into it. If you're going to take the Misesian view or the Friedmanite view that economics is value free and you can just talk about the consequences. But if you're going to make moral claims like rights, like this person has a right to do X, there has to be a moral theory behind it by definition of what the term rights means. And what
well, why is that? I mean,
because right is defined as a moral claim to something. Well, what's moral?
Well, but
What's
I don't
moral?
know. I mean, when we were talking earlier about the definition of rights, we're saying it's a justified claim.
Well, we said both. It was justified in a moral claim, but justify you trace back to justice.
Well,
What is
okay,
just? But just is a moral claim as well.
Well, let me back up a little bit. I mean, I think that the best way to describe Hoppe's view is that rights are. I mean, I don't know if he gives a coherent definition, but and he actually sometimes blends together possession with rights, thinking like an economist. But I think he would think of them as justified claims, and by justified he means you can give good reasons for it, and the reasons for him are those that could satisfy the community of people that could possibly be part of this debate. So that's his approach.
But he calls
the
it
reason
an
I
ethic.
brought it.
He calls it an ethic. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Correct.
I didn't mean
correct. No, he does call it an ethic, and that's why I think there's some subtle distinction in some people's minds between the word ethics and morals. Sometimes we use them interchangeably, sometimes we mean them differently. So, for example, as an attorney, there's lawyer ethics, but that's not really morality. That's like a code of conduct that governs a given endeavor or profession, right? Medical ethics, for example. So the word ethics, and then political ethics is when we discuss which laws we should have or so I agree these things blend together, but morality itself and ethics are, I think, a little bit distinct, which is why I tried to use the word morality talking about Crusoe, and that comes from my Randian days. I mean, now this could be my own misinterpretation of Rand, but I believe that the objectivist view, like, so Rand, because her ethics, her morality is hypothetical.
But it's not hypothetical. It's conditional. That's what I think.
Okay, fine. It's conditional.
Yeah.
She could not say that Crusoe alone on this island is committing an immoral act if he commits suicide. Like, if you don't want to live, then there's no choice to live that you can build a morality on, right?
Yeah, well, yeah.
But I secretly think that secretly she would say that it's immoral to do that, but she knows she can't justify that. So she would have to admit that Crusoe, not say has the right, but Crusoe would not be immoral if he committed suicide, because morality depends upon the choice to live. But she would say that if Crusoe wants to live,
right,
then he should do certain things according with his nature, like living on this island. And certain things, like if he's too lazy and he, then that's immoral, right? And I agree with that. I was just trying to place where I see morality, because say libertarians often, if pressed, they'll say something like this. They view morality as a proper subset, and I'm speaking in math terms now, a proper subset of. Wait, I got it backwards. Illegality is a proper subset of immorality. In other words, not every action that is immoral is a rights violation.
That's true.
However, every rights violation is immoral. That's one formulation.
Right, but you would need a theory of morality to make that claim that you just made. And that's
correct.
Precisely my point about Hoppe is he doesn't have that. He starts and he says ethic, and you just said it addresses shoulds. What should the laws be?
Correct.
Should is equivalent. Yeah. Should is equivalent to ought. So I mean, I know he claims to have transcended, or he doesn't get into the is-ought dichotomy, but he claims to have bridged it, whether he admits it or not, because you're talking about what should be. This is how people should behave. They shouldn't violate each other's rights. We should have an anarcho-capitalist society. Those are shoulds. Those are oughts. They're moral terms.
Okay. Yeah, and you're right. And I can only defend Hans so far. This is his theory. I have my own theory. My own theory of rights is called estoppel, which is complementary, but it's not the same.
And I would love to have you back on to discuss that as well sometime.
But let me ask you a question.
Sure.
So you're an objectivist?
Yes,
Are you a minarchist or an anarchist?
minarchist. I actually debated the aforementioned Michael Humer on anarchism versus
Okay.
minarchism.
And are you pro IP or anti IP?
I'm pro. I will say this. I'm not saying I couldn't be convinced otherwise. It's really not an
Right.
area that I've like the stuff
No.
we're talking about now, ethics and rights. I've thought about backwards, forwards, in every way I can, written extensively
Right.
to myself on the
Right.
subject. IP, I
Yeah.
haven't. I don't want to use the word intuition, but my inclination is to defend it. But I would not be prepared to defend
Right.
intellectual
No, no, and,
property
that's a fair
in this
response, and
context.
I can always respect a minarchist and a Randy minarchist, but IP is, I'm not say trust me, but like if you're open minded enough, like I see. So that's a different issue. There, that's totally indefensible, and I understand why there's confusion on it. But I'm just trying to situate you. And are you more like an ARI or a objectivist, or
I'm
is there a type
independent.
you are?
I'm
Okay, independent.
independent.
Okay, good.
But if you're asking me in the debate between, say, open and closed objectivist, I would be closed. And I think that what I mean by that is if somebody else formulates something in a given way, other than Ayn Rand, that's not a part of objectivism.
That's fine.
Uh,
That's fine.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, it's
but
fine.
that
That's
doesn't
fine. I
mean that
mean,
I agree with everything she had to say. Just that when
right.
I do differ with her, those are Michael Leibowitz's thoughts. They're not a part of the
I
objective.
got you. I got you. No, so okay. So here's what I was going to ask you. So you believe in rights
Sure.
more along the lines we've discussed, although with the minarchist exception and possibly IP, but still, you believe in rights more or less like I think we do. Um, um, and you might be right that Hans Hoppe doesn't have a fully fledged theory of morality. Um, whether you need that to make a good case for why the minimum wage law is bad, I'm not 100% sure. I mean, there's lots of reasons why minimum wage law is obviously bad.
Well, it depends what you mean by bad in that case. If you're saying bad in the sense where Mises would say it, Mises, I mean, where it wouldn't attain the results that its advocates want, you'd be right. But if you're saying bad in the term of it's unethical to tell an employer how much he can pay somebody and tell an employee how much they can make, if it's bad in that sense, then it is moral. It's a moral argument you're making.
Well, it's true, but you could also make a consequential. You could say, listen, if you think that the minimum wage is going to raise employment, you're wrong.
Yeah, that's the
So
Mises's. That's Mises's argument. That's what
right,
I
but
mean.
these
Yeah,
things
you
are. I
could
think
do
these
that.
things are complementary.
Sure. I
They're
don't
not.
disagree with that. I
They're not
just
hostile
disagree
to
with
each
I
other.
disagree with Hoppe. For instance, so suppose you and I are having a discussion, right? So Hoppe would say, look, they're both, it's implied in the very fact that they're having this discussion. It's inherent in the discussion that they both accept self-ownership because they're not resorting to aggression. They're
Okay.
trying to hash it out. Well, why couldn't it just be that both of us believe in self-ownership and that's why we do this, but we could be wrong? How can he get around that?
I'm trying to follow your. What's the difference between the
Well,
two
the
things you
difference
just said?
is that human beliefs can be mistaken. So for instance, I could kick you in the shin and think it's the right thing to do, but I'm
No, no,
wrong.
no, no, no. Okay, so here's I think here's part of the problem. Your word belief here, I think. So this is one thing I appreciate about Austrians, is a sort of dualism. Like you treat different things differently.
Sure.
So the factual realm, the descriptive realm, is distinct from the prescriptive or the normative
But
or the
Hans
value
claims to
realm.
have gotten around that. That's
Well,
my point.
what I'm saying is, if I say I believe there's a rock on the ground outside my window,
Mhm.
that's a factual claim about something that's either true or not true.
Okay, so wouldn't my
But
belief about whether
if I
something's
say
right or wrong, wouldn't that be, he claims
I don't
there's
think,
actual, so Hans doesn't claim that there's actual self-ownership. He just says it's
I mean, I
basically, it's
don't,
just about
I
what people believe.
well, I
Because
don't
if
know.
that's the case, then there's no real
It's
argument.
not about, so this is why norms are different than descriptive assertions. If I say that
No,
I believe you own yourself, it's not the same kind of statement as saying I believe that your house is on fire.
well,
One is a
it's a truth
descriptive.
claim, isn't it? Aren't they both
Well,
truth
that's
claims?
a good question. I mean, I'm not a philosopher, but I'm not sure it's the same kind of truth claim.
Because I mean, like you said in your book, that Hans is making is he is crossing the is ought gap, right? That he does that. He says he's not, but he is. And it seems to me that if you're making a claim, if I say that I have rights, I'm making a truth claim. It's either true or it isn't. And if it can be true, I can believe the wrong end of it. So
I
for
wouldn't.
instance,
Go ahead.
I don't understand how not. Like I don't know how you can
I would
get
call. I
around that.
mean, I would. It. I would not call it true. I would say it's justified or not. Like if I make a normative assertion, I can either justify it or I can't. If now there's a middle ground thing where, like, if I tell you as a matter of fact that I, Stephan Kinsella, happen to value world peace, that's a factual statement about my values that I happen to hold. But it's not a justification of those values. I would have to come up with a justification for that. And the way I look at it, there's two ways I can do that. I can either uh, appeal to your similar set of core values and say that you and I both agree on A, B, and C. We don't know why. We can't justify it. We just happen to prefer this. But given that, can't you see, if you have a little bit of economic knowledge, that this is what we should prefer as a policy or a law? Like that's a consequentialist type of argument, but it's appealing to commonly shared values. And
It
on the other
is.
hand, I think as Leonard Peikoff one time said, if you're talking to someone and they're so irrational, they won't even admit that A is A, then your only choice is to walk away.
Sure.
And
There's no doubt
so if
about that.
someone won't admit that they share the value with me of peace and prosperity of the human race and they prefer death and destruction, then I'm not going to get anywhere with them with a rational discussion. I'm not going to appeal to their commonly shared values because they don't have them. But when you find people that have them, I guess you could have philosophers inquire deeper and find out why we could justify that. But for this moment, we don't really care because we already share these common values and we can build upon that on that base. Um,
Okay, well, why in the case of argumentation? So you and I have a debate, right? He says that that implies that we both accept self-ownership, the right to ourselves. But why wouldn't it just imply that we both accept the right to debate? Why would it be, like you say, it has to be generalizable, universalizable, whatever
because
the word is, but why does it
because
have to get universalized?
because the purpose of the debate
Mm-hmm.
about when we're talking about laws and norms and rights,
Mm-hmm.
the purpose of the debate is to settle and to decide what the rights are going to be outside of the debate. It's not.
Yeah.
This is one of the critiques that Bob Murphy and Gene Callahan made in their, which I discuss in my book too. They criticize Hoppe. They're saying like, well, these norms are only good for the duration of the debate. And then they bring up a slave example. You could debate with your slave, something like that. Um, so again, the purpose of the debate is to decide what the norms are that are justified, not just during the debate, but even outside of the debate.
Right. So
That would be
why
my
is it,
answer.
but why is it that the norms of the debate would have to be applicable to behaviors outside of the debate?
Because you can never decide norms for behaviors outside of the debate except in an actual discourse that happens during a real debate.
Right. But
Because when you're engaging with each other and you're not debating, you're not having a discourse.
no, that's what I'm saying is this, and I'm not defending socialism. Let's be clear. But if you and
Yes,
I
you
have,
are.
if you and I have a debate, and we're engaging whether we should have a socialist system or not, the context is completely different. I'm saying, look, in this context, we need to have a discussion. We need to respect each other's rights. But once you bring into the context a lot of other complicated factors, for instance, the fact that employers exploit their employees. Not everybody's born with equal intelligence, a la Rawls. Not everybody comes in with a fair shake. So therefore, we need to implement a different system. The context is completely different than it is in a discussion that we're having. So I don't know how you extrapolate from an argument and just apply it universally to situations that vary so vastly from the context of the discussion.
Well, you just said you weren't defending socialism, but
I'm not, because I would argue
you
against.
just brought up exploitation,
No,
which
but
is
I
a
would
Marxist
argue,
thing. No,
if I
I'm
was
kind of
really to
joking.
argue, I would argue against exploitation, obviously. I'm just saying that there's no a priori reason why a discussion about socialism negates socialism. The context is so different. You would have to actually make an argument against socialism. You wouldn't just say, well, the very fact that you're arguing for socialism proves socialism's wrong, therefore get rid of socialism. People would, I mean, talking about accepted values, who would accept that?
Well, and his argument is not, it's not so simple either. It's not just the fact that we're sitting across from each other, across from a campfire, having a discussion, and temporarily we have to respect each other's um, bodily integrity and not coerce each other. But again, I would say that if you accept the principle that you should not coerce someone because they own their body, then that principle extends beyond the argument. But
And I
his
don't
other
think you
point,
do. That's my point, Stephan, is that just because you're engaged in an argument doesn't mean you respect it. It means you respect it in that instance. It doesn't mean that you universally respect it.
well, and his other point is that argumentation is not just this hypothetical thing, it's a practical affair.
Sure.
So we don't only own our bodies, we have to own our standing room, and we had to have food to get there, which requires the use of physical materials in the world and all this kind of stuff. So the ownership right of your body extends beyond and includes the right to manipulate and move around in the world. And again, if you have a peaceful presupposition, then that means that you prefer people to be able to use these things peacefully, which requires property rights. I mean, that's his basic argument. If it doesn't persuade you, here let me. That's about as good as I can do. Here's what I recommend. He did, he kind of went silent and let me and others defend him for years. But I think around 2015 or 2016 at the Property Freedom Society conference that he gives every year in Turkey, he did a long. He revisited the argumentation ethics, and he talked about some of his critics like Bob Murphy and Gene Callahan, who make some of the same arguments you like. Like let me give one example. One of the arguments Callahan makes, not just this, oh, it's only good for the duration of the argument, but the supposed counterexample of someone arguing with their slave. And I think the problem there is, okay, if someone is a slave unjustly, then what Hoppe would say is that, yeah, you could for an hour give your slave a break and say, hey, come into my courtyard and let's argue. You can, but then after that, I'm going to return you to, doing your labor under subjective force. But for an hour, we can talk. And the point is that Hoppe would argue that during that conversation, if the slave says, how can you justify keeping me as a slave? We're no different. We're both human beings with the same capacities. And if you have the right to own me, I have the right to own you. So there's no logical justification for you to own me. Hoppe would say that, yeah, the slave owner couldn't justify it. So his point is that the claim is simply not justified. It's not that you couldn't command your slave to pretend like he's arguing with you for an hour. It's simply that the argument couldn't be justified. Okay. On the other hand, something I think Hoppe never mentions, which I've mentioned in my writing, you could have a slave that you have a right to enslave, like someone who, broke into your home and killed your family, and you have to put them in your little jail cell for a couple of days until the authorities come and get him. So you're actually treating the guy like a slave. You could have a conversation with him, and if he confronted you and he says, hey, there's a contradiction in your argument, like you're claiming that you can own yourself, but you're not granting me the same rights. And then the response would be, yeah, because we're different. You committed aggression and I didn't. So in other words, it's okay to treat people differently if there's a reason, but the reason can't be particularizable, like, oh, it's because I'm me and you're you. which is what the socialist claim is.
But what if the slaveholder made the same argument? The unjustified slaveholder, but not according to this, but I'm saying according to what I believe. Say he's what I would judge to be an unjustifiable slaveholder. He owns the slave. The slave says to him, look, we're equal. I'm a human just like you. There's no legitimate reason why you should be able to own me. I can't own you. And the slaveholder says, you are not equal to me because of your race, your ethnicity, your
Correct.
birth, whatever.
Correct.
Now, the slave, if he's going to have this debate, has to prove that case.
Well,
He has to make the case in the argument. It's not given just by the fact that
there's a
they're
question
arguing.
of who has the burden of proof. But I mean,
Well, yeah, I mean, but
I think the point is, so the point is this, as Hoppe says, using Kantian terminology, if you make an argument that's universalizable, it has to be grounded in the nature of reality, which means you have to be able to prove it. And so you start from the bottom and you work your way up, sort of like an onion, and you say, okay, all we know from the beginning is that we're both two rational beings who can communicate with each other. We're two sapient humans, right? So all we know right now is that you're claiming superior rights over me, but all we know is that you're just a human actor in the world. But you can't deny that I'm also a human actor. So if that's all you got, you can't say there's a relevant distinction between us. Okay, then the guy will say, oh, well, I'm a man and you're a woman. Or he might say, I'm white and you're black. But then you have to say, well, why is that? I mean, you could say, my first name starts with an S and yours starts with a P. I mean, you could, when you do these things that are totally irrelevant to the argument, it's the same as not giving a reason, which is the same as the might makes right world, which is the same as not having real dialogue. So if he claims that, oh no, I have the rights over you because I'm a man and you're a woman. Yeah, I admit that we're both rational human beings, but I'm a man and you're a woman. So that's why it's different. Or black and white, whatever. But he has to explain why that's relevant. Why is the color of your skin
right,
or your gender relevant to the capacity
it.
for rights?
So
yes.
It's something to be hashed out in the argument, not something that's just going to be assumed because of the argument.
If he assumes that he's just asserting it and he's not going to, and this is the other thing, the entire purpose, according to Hoppe, the entire purpose of this justificatory endeavor is the desire of civilized people to try to come up with a reasonable, peaceful way for us to live together, right? Which means that you have to, when we consider what's a universalizable claim and what's a claim based in reason, it's got to be something that can appeal to basically potentially everyone in the argument that will be affected by the outcome of it. Which is why particularizable claims will never work. No one will ever accept them. Like if you have a crowd of people arguing over something and one guy goes, I should be the king of you all because I'm me and you're not me. No one's going to accept that because they could make the same claim. And if the point of the discussion is to reduce conflict, you can never have a rule that generates conflict. That's another theme of Hoppe's. And a rule that's particularizable, that's merely done by verbal decree, is particularizable and will generate conflict because everyone could do it. You got to point to some objective fact that everyone can see, which is why property rights, I mean, Hoppe.
But not everybody sees that. See, that's what I disagree with. And so many people reject that type of thing out of hand. So it can't just be it's something that's going to appeal to everybody. Nothing's going to appeal to everybody.
But there's no way to achieve a consensus among a group of people unless you can find common objective facts, or as Hoppe calls them, intersubjectively ascertainable, which is why the very function of property rights, the very nature of property rights means that property borders have to be objective, which is why we believe in, like, a human being can own, okay, it's objectively true that I control my body because I can demonstrate that I control it. I can move it around. And then if I homestead a piece of land, I've transformed it with my labor or put a fence around it. I've done something to, as Hoppe calls it, emborder it. But that embordering is a fact in the world that people can see, where they can see a link between me and the thing. And then in an argument about who owns it, I can appeal to that publicly visible, objective, intersubjectively ascertainable fact. Whereas by contrast, if you had a rule that says, you can own something by merely verbal decree, then no one would know who owns anything. So if I said,
Mhm.
I own the moon, no, you own the moon, I own North America, I own this field because I just said so, but everyone could say so at the same time. So those kinds of rules could never work to solve the very purpose of property rights, which is to reduce conflict. They would only generate conflict, right? And so by the same token, when you have a discourse trying to resolve a practical dispute, because people only have discourse when there's a possibility of a practical dispute. And when there's a practical dispute or a conflict, it's always over a thing that they're conflicting over. They know what it is, and that
Sure.
helps define the boundaries of it. And then that helps define the evidence you need to show who has a better claim. And if you have to appeal to your neighbors or the community at a certain point, that's all human beings can do in the real world. Use reason, use fairness, and hope that the human race gets better and better over time at this process
See,
where
fairness, though, that's another moral term.
it is.
And
I
you need
agree.
to have morality, which brings me kind of to my last question for you.
All right.
So, what if you have a person or a group of people who don't engage in argument? They simply aggress to get what they want.
Yeah,
They wouldn't be engaged in a performative contradiction. How could we judge their
correct.
behavior to be wrong?
Well, I think that we would just, I mean, um, we would treat them as outlaws or as Hoppe calls them technical technical difficulties or something like.
Well, we can call them whatever they want, but could we call them immoral? Could we say that they were wrong? They
Well,
haven't had the
so
contradiction. There's no contradiction in their behavior at all.
well, first of all, whether we classify them as wrong or not doesn't change how we have to respond to them. They're a
No,
threat
but
to
the
our.
claim is that an ethical theory has to be universalizable. If it can't apply to them, if you can't say their behavior is wrong because they're engaging in that, then it can't be
No,
universalized.
that's not how I look at it. I think that universalizability is a requirement of a claim that you make in a civilized discussion trying to justify a given proposition.
Right.
It's not saying that. So here's the way I look at it. So when we live on the earth, we face in this mortal life, we face challenges because we live in a world of scarcity and we're not little mini gods. Pestilence, drought, tornadoes, wild animals. If there's a tiger coming at me, um, uh, the tiger is not immoral. Wouldn't say he's moral, but
But he's not a human either.
he's not a human. But
So
if there's a space alien coming down here to attack me, and whether he's sapient or not, I mean, the point is, you have to deal with the tiger like, or mosquitoes, or pestilence, or drought, as what Hoppe calls technical problems. Okay, and so among humans, the humans that we can deal with by reason, that share our core values, we can deal with by reason. But the ones that you can't, you have to regard them as a technical problem.
okay.
So, like, I would just treat these guys like lions. Okay. Either you kill them or you avoid them or you defend yourselves from them somehow. Um, Now, the only morality of the situation would be your morality, because they're apparently outside of morality. They don't care. They don't care. But, so your question would be, hey, to my fellow moral people, am I justified in shooting this guy? And they'd go, yeah, he's he won't listen to reason and he's determined to hurt you. So yeah, treat him like a tiger. Um, so that's how I look at it. So what I call them immoral, I would call them twisted or sick human beings, or defective or damaged human beings, of course. But if they simply are sociopaths who don't have the values that we share, in a sense, they're like intelligent animals, which are just a problem. You can only use reason against people that are willing to listen to reason. This is why Peikoff said you have to walk away from someone
Sure.
who renounces reason altogether.
Okay. Well,
If someone
Stephan,
says I believe in contradictions, it's like, then what
well,
can you
yeah,
say?
no, you can't. There's something that we both definitely agree on. So listen, I would love to have you back on sometime to discuss your estoppel theory of ethics. I thought that was a fascinating theory that you put together. and also sometime maybe have you back on to discuss my own ethical theory. Well, not my, you know what I mean, Ayn Rand's ethical theory.
Sure, be happy to.
You've been great. Thank you so much for coming on and having this discussion. Where can people find you?
StephanKinsella.com is my website, and my book is online free there. Lee will this book here. So not trying to sell it. It's for free.
It's in PDF form, free on your website.
It is, and it's going to be up, and I'm going to do EPUB in about a month as soon as I get some typos fixed.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much again. And for now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.